I think it's good we start with Surah Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, maliki yawmiddin, iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'een, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim, sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim, ghayri al-maghdubi alayhim, wa lad-dallin, sadaqa Allahu al-'aliyyul 'azim. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله ولا أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. So this series has never been a collection of disconnected talks or sessions. From the very first session we declared that each discussion would build upon the last, brick upon brick, until the structure stands complete. We began with the foundations, Tawheed, or the oneness that demands everything else fade before it. We moved to Adala, the justice that governs every divine decree. We traced Nubuwwah, the chain of messengers who marked the road. And we immersed ourselves in Wilaya and Imama, learning that guidance did not end with the seal of the Prophet, but continued through those who inherited his mantle. And now we walk through Mahdawiyyah, the doctrine of the awaited one who stands at the culmination of this journey. Within this section, we've arrived at a multi-part arc, 3 movements that form their own cumulative structure within the larger series. Due to the depth of the material, one of these movements spans, initially it was going to be 2, but multiple sessions. Last week we announced that the question driving this phase was, how did the community live during the long night of the Occultation? And we agreed that this could not be answered in a single session. The material was simply too dense. The connection is too important, and the contemporary application is too urgent. So we divided the answer into 3 movements, each building upon the last, just as the series itself has always built. The second movement, due to its depth, requires maybe 4 sessions to complete. Initially it was going to be 2, now it's become 4. The first movement, which we covered last week in our previous session, was the negative, what must be avoided. We examined the false dawn, the Qarmatian catastrophe that filled the well of Zamzam with corpses, the Zaydi dilemma that wasted righteous blood without achieving the goal, the neo-Khawarij of our own time, ISIS or Daesh and their ilk, Al-Qaeda and so on, who slaughter in the name of Islam while never once striking the actual enemies of Islam and of humanity. We learned to distinguish, to see through the mask of revolution when it covers the face of heresy, to recognize prematurity when it wears the costume of courage. But discernment alone is not enough. Once you can see the true dawn on the horizon, you must still survive long enough to reach it. The night is long, the enemies are many. The believer who stands exposed, broadcasting his faith and everything to those who wish to destroy him, will not live to see the sunrise. So tonight we turn to the second movement, the defensive. How did they protect themselves? The answer is a single word, a word that has been slandered for centuries, reduced to a caricature, weaponized against the Shia and the Muslims by those who do not understand it, and those who understand it all too well. That word is Taqiyyah. For 1400 years, the enemies of Ahlulbayt have mocked this concept, saying, the Shia are liars, their religion permits them to lie. You cannot trust anything they say because they practice Taqiyyah. This slander has been repeated so often that tragically even some Muslims have internalized it. Even some Shia are embarrassed by the word, unsure how to defend it, half convinced that there's something shameful in it. Tonight we reclaim it. We will show that Taqiyyah is not a Shia invention. It is a Quranic permission revealed by God himself, validated by the Prophet, practiced by the companions and Ahlulbayt, and written into the fitrah, the innate nature of creation itself. We will show that Taqiyyah is not lying, it is shielding, that the very word comes from the same root as Taqwa, that piety that every Muslim is commanded to cultivate. We will show that Taqiyyah is not the opposite of courage, it is the companion of wisdom. The Imams who practiced it were not cowards, They were strategists who understood that survival is the precondition for victory. And we will show that Taqiyyah has limits, hard limits, divine limits, beyond which it becomes not only not permitted, but forbidden to remain silent. The community survived the occultation because they learned to protect themselves. They learnt when to speak and when to remain silent. They learnt when to stand exposed and when to blend into the shadows. They learnt the difference between the concealment that preserves faith and the hypocrisy that destroys it. This is the shield, and without it there would be no Shia today. There would be no Muslims today. No Hausa, no Marja'iyya, no Islamic revolution, no Islamic republic, no resistance. The kernel would have been crushed before it could grow. Tonight we study the shield, its Quranic foundation, its linguistic roots, its jurisprudential boundaries, and its contemporary applications. We ask God the Most High to grant us the wisdom to know when silence protects and when it betrays, to grant us the courage to speak when speaking is obligatory, and the patience to remain silent when silence serves as truth. May we be among those who carry the shield without becoming cowards, and who lower the shield without becoming reckless. Please give me a loud salawat, and we move on to the recap.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
So in the previous session last week, we opened this arc with a warning. We anchored ourselves in the Quranic diagnosis of human nature, the flaw of hastiness, that God names in Surah Al-Isra, the chapter of the night journey, where God says, and man is ever hasty. And of course this is from Surah Al-Isra, chapter of the night journey, 17th chapter of the Quran, verse 11. This hastiness, this impatience, this ajula, this rushing, is the root of the false dawn. The hasty man sees a glimmer on the horizon and runs towards it, convinced it is the sunrise. He does not wait to see if that light will spread or fade. He does not consult the guides who have walked this path before. He rushes, and in his rushing, he often runs straight into his own destruction. We examine two archetypes of this failure. Firstly, the heretical model, the Khameneians. The first heresy wearing the mask of revolution was wearing the mask of revolution. In 317 after Hijrah, the Khameneians attacked Mecca during the Hajj. They slaughtered 30,000 pilgrims in the holy sanctuary, in the Haram. They filled the well of Zamzam with corpses. They stole the black stone and they kept it for 22 years. And their leader, Abu Tahir, stood at the threshold of the Kaaba and said, I am by God and God is by me. He creates the creation and I annihilate them. And the reference is in the write-up. This was where what we know as Batinism led, the belief that the inner truth abrogates the outer law. They stripped the shell from the kernel and the kernel rotted. They claimed to possess the spirit of Islam while massacring its body. We invoke Shahin Mutahhari's warning, you cannot preserve a kernel by destroying its shell. The Sharia is not an obstacle to spiritual truth. It is the vessel that carries spiritual truth through time. Then we looked at the premature model, the Zaydis. The second archetype was not heresy, rather it was prematurity. Zayd ibn Ali, may God bless his pure soul, was sincere. He was brave. He was righteous. He raised his sword against the Umayyad tyranny in 122 AH, calling the people to justice and to the family of the Prophet. And he was killed. He was martyred. His body was crucified and left to rot. His nephew, Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, validated his intent, saying, May God have mercy on my uncle Zayd. Indeed, he invited to the pleasing one from the family of Muhammad, ar-Rida min Ali Muhammad. And had he been victorious, he would have fulfilled that promise. And the reference is in the write-up. Zayd was a martyr, but his timing was wrong. The capacity was not there. The people were not ready. And so his noble blood watered the earth without achieving the goal. This is the tragedy of the premature dawn. It wastes the righteous without advancing the cause. We then examined the theological proof that power does not equal authority. 3 times in Islamic history the black stone was displaced. The black stone from the Kaaba was displaced. and 3 times only the hand of the divinely appointed could restore it. The Quraysh could build the walls of the Kaaba, but they could not place its heart. That required the hand of the Prophet even before his mission. Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf could conquer Mecca with catapults, but the stone rejected his mortar. It settled only when Imam Sajjad, peace and blessings be upon him, placed it with the name of God. And the Qarmatians could steal the stone for 22 years, but they could not make it mean anything. It was the hidden Imam, may our souls be his ransom, who appeared briefly to place it and declare, "By God it came to us, and by God it is placed." The lesson: the architects of chaos can displace reality, but they cannot stabilize it. Only the one whom God has chosen can do that. Finally, we examined how the premature dawn of the Zaydis has been transformed in our own time. Ansarullah, the movement in Yemen, comes from the Zaydi tradition. But by integrating into the axis of resistance, by adopting the discipline of strategic patience and the framework of Wilayat al-Faqih, they have transcended the old categories. They are no longer the isolated uprising that burns out. They are the morning star that Sheikh Parhayan identifies as the obligatory introduction to the reappearance, constructing what we call the zamina, the foundation for whatever is to come. The hadith promises, there is no flag among the flags more guiding than the flag of the Yamani. The reference is in the write-up. Whether Ansarullah is that flag or the preparation for it, they have proven that Yemen can produce a resistance that endures, that neither fades like the false dawn, nor burns itself out like the premature. And the lesson is discernment. This was the first movement of our arc, the negative, learning what to avoid. Before the waiter can protect, before the waiter can build, the waiter must first learn to see, to distinguish the false dawn from the true, to recognize heresy when it wears the mask of revolution, to recognize prematurity when it wears the mask of courage. This is the knowledge of what not to do, and it is essential, because the night is long and the glimmers are many, and the hasty person will be deceived 100 times, 1,000,000 times even, before the true dawn finally breaks. And the question that remains? Well, discernment alone does not guarantee survival. You may see the true dawn clearly. You may recognize every false dawn for what it is. You may possess perfect clarity about where the path leads, and still be killed before you reach it. The believer who stands in the open, broadcasting his faith to every ear, declaring his allegiance to every enemy, refusing every form of caution, this believer may be brave, but he may also be dead. And the dead do not build. The dead do not raise the next generation. The dead do not preserve the kernel for those who come after. The community did not survive the occultation through discernment alone. They survived because they learned to protect themselves. They learnt the art of the shield. And it is to this shield that we now turn. Please give me a loud salawat and we move on to the main section, which is the geopolitics of waiting, the shield, and forging the shield.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وأجل فرجهم.
So firstly, we start with the Quranic Anchor, the permission to shield. Before we examine the history, before we trace the jurisprudence, before we defend Taqiyyah against its slanderers, we must first anchor ourselves in the Quran. For if Taqiyyah were merely a Shia invention, a cultural practice, a historical convenience, then perhaps the critics would have a point. Perhaps it would be something to outgrow, something to apologize for, something to quickly set aside in the modern age. But Taqiyyah is none of these things. It is a Quranic permission, revealed by God, validated by the Prophet, demonstrated by the companions, and it remains in force until the day of judgment. Let us examine the evidence. So first we have the primary verse, the exception clause. In Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, God establishes a general prohibition, and then he opens the door. In Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, 3rd chapter of the Quran, verse number 28, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Let not the believers take the disbelievers as allies rather than the believers. And whoever does that has nothing with God, except when you protect yourselves from them as a precaution. And God warns you of himself, and to God is the final destination." Now notice the structure. The verse begins with a prohibition. Do not take the disbelievers as allies instead of the believers. This is the golden rule. This is the general rule. The believer's loyalty belongs to the community of faith, not to those who oppose it. But then comes the exception, except when you protect yourselves from them as a precaution. The word used here is tattaqu, and this has the same root as Taqiyyah and Taqwa. It means to shield, to guard, to protect oneself. And God himself has placed this exception into the verse. He has opened the door. Allama Tabatabai in Al-Mizan explains the scope of this permission. He says, the exception in his saying, except when you protect yourselves from them as a precaution, is from the preceding prohibition. The meaning is, do not take them as allies unless you fear from them a fear that permits taqiyyah. In that case, it is permissible for you to outwardly display allegiance to them with the tongue, while concealing enmity and aversion inwardly, in order to protect yourselves from their harm. The reference is in the write-up. This is not a Shia interpretation imposed upon on the text. This is the plain meaning of the Arabic. God prohibited one thing, then created an exception for situations of danger. The believer who finds himself under threat is permitted by God's own word to display outwardly that which does not reflect his inward reality. This is the Quranic foundation of Taqiyyah. Let's now look at the story of Ammar when the tongue betrays under torture. But perhaps someone will say, this is all a theory. Show us an example. Show us that the Prophet accepted this in practice. Very well. Let us turn to Surah An-Nahl, the chapter of the bee, and the story of Ammar ibn Yasir. May God rest his pure soul, the companion of the Prophet and Imam Ali. Ammar was among the earliest converts to Islam. His parents, Yasir and Sumayyah, were the first martyrs in Islam, killed by the Quraysh for refusing to renounce their faith. Sumayyah was stabbed by Abu Jahl himself. Abu Jahl was one of the elites of Mecca and one of the loudest and strongest voices against Islam and the Prophet. They both died with the name of God upon their lips. But Ammar survived. And the Quraysh took him. They tortured him. They beat him. They demanded that he renounce Prophet Muhammad and that he praise their idols. And under unbearable pressure of that torture, with his flesh torn and his spirit crushed, Ammar spoke the words that they demanded. He uttered words of disbelief with his tongue. And then he wept. He came to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family and his righteous companions, broken with shame. He confessed what he had said. He feared that he had left the fold of Islam, that his words under torture had destroyed everything. And then revelation descended. Surah An-Nahl, the chapter of the bee, 16th chapter of the Quran, verse 106, which says, "Whoever disbelieves in God after his belief, except for one who is compelled while his heart is secure in faith, but whoever opens his breast to disbelief, upon them is the wrath of God, and for them is a great punishment." Now the verse here makes a distinction that changes everything. There are two types of people who might speak words of disbelief. The first is the one who opens his heart to disbelief, who welcomes it, who means it, whose heart has turned. For this person there is the wrath of God. The second is the one who is compelled, whose tongue speaks under duress while his heart remains settled and secure in faith, mutma'in. For this person there is no blame. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family and his righteous companions, looked at Ammar and asked, "How did you find your heart?" To which Ammar replied, "Secure in faith." The Prophet then said, "Then if they return to you then if they return you to it, return to it. This is explicit prophetic permission. The tongue under duress does not bind the heart. The words spoken to preserve life do not nullify the faith held within. And if the torture resumes, the believer may speak those words again, because God himself has made the exception. This is not a Shia hadith. This is recorded across the traditions of all Muslims. The story of Ammar is proof that Taqiyyah was practiced in the time of the Prophet, was validated by the Prophet, and is enshrined in the Quran as a permanent dispensation. Now we look at the believer of Pharaoh's family, concealment as a Quranic model. But there's another verse, perhaps even more striking, that establishes concealment not merely as a permission, but as a praiseworthy model. In Surah Al-Ghafir, the chapter of the Forgiver, God tells us of a man who lived in the household of Pharaoh himself. In Surah Al-Ghafir, chapter of the Forgiver, 40th chapter of the Quran, verse 28, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And a believing man from the family of Pharaoh who concealed his faith said, 'Would you kill a man because he said, my Lord is God, while he has brought you clear proofs from your Lord?'" Now consider what this verse tells us. Here is a man living in the innermost circle of the greatest tyrant of his age. Pharaoh, who claimed divinity. Pharaoh, who enslaved an entire population. Pharaoh, who murdered the children of the Israelites and built his throne upon their bones. And in his own household, amongst his own family, there was a believer. But this believer did not stand up on the first day and announce his faith. He did not broadcast his allegiance to Moses in the court of the tyrant. He concealed. The Quran uses the word yaktumu. He was hiding, covering, keeping secret his belief. Was he a coward? Was he a hypocrite? Was he condemned for this concealment? Quite the contrary. God preserves his story in the Quran as an example for all generations. God tells us that this man was a mu'min, a believer. His concealment did not negate his faith, it protected it. And notice what happened next. The man did not remain silent forever. When the moment came, when Pharaoh moved to kill Moses, the believer spoke. He emerged from his concealment. He challenged the tyrant in his own court. He risked everything to defend the truth. This is the model. Concealment until the moment demands speech. Silence until silence becomes betrayal. The shield carried until the shield must be lowered and the sword drawn. Allama Tabatabai in Al-Mizan says regarding this verse, "He used to conceal his faith from Pharaoh and his chiefs, but when the matter reached the point where Moses would be killed, he revealed his faith and defended him with all that he could." This is Taqiyyah in its fullness. Concealment when concealment serves the truth, and revelation when revelation becomes obligatory. So over here, we need to have a necessary clarification. Who are the disbelievers? The verses that we have cited speak of al-kafirun, the disbelievers. And it would be easy to say, reading these verses in isolation, to conclude that Islam views all non-Muslims as enemies from whom the believer must hide. This is not the case. The Shia theological tradition, rooted in the Quran itself, draws a careful distinction between the types of disbelief. Not all who stand outside Islam stand there for the same reason, and God, the most just and the most merciful, does not judge them by the same measure. So first of all, you have the Quranic foundation of the Mustad'af. In Surah An-Nisa, the chapter of the women, God describes a category of people who are neither believers nor punishable disbelievers. He says in Surah An-Nisa, the chapter of the women, 4th chapter of the Quran, verses 98 to 99, "Except for the oppressed among men, women and children, who cannot devise a plan, nor are they guided to a way. For those it is expected that God will pardon them, and God is ever pardoning and forgiving." The word used here is Mustad'af, the weakened, the oppressed, the incapacitated. These are people who do not believe, but not because they saw the truth and they rejected it. They do not believe because they could not find the way. The path was blocked. The message was distorted. The truth never reached them in a form that they could recognize. And God says it is expected that God will pardon them. This is not a minor exception. This is an entire category of humanity. And as we shall see, the scholars of the Hausa argue that it includes the majority of non-Muslims in the world today. So we have a theological distinction, the idea of qasir and muqassir. The scholars of Qom have systematized this Quranic insight into precise distinctions. So first you have al-jahil al-qasir, the inculpable ignorant. This is someone whose failure to believe is due to factors outside of their control. No proper access to authentic information, massive misrepresentation of Islam, an environment where falsehood is presented as the obvious truth, and they have no realistic path to the alternative. Second, you have al-jahil al-muqassir, the culpable ignorant. This is someone who had the means and the opportunity to discover the truth, but chose to remain in denial out of arrogance, stubbornness, or love for the worldly position. And the third, you have al-kafir al-mu'annid, which is the obstinate disbeliever. This is someone who knows the truth or strongly suspects it and actively rejects it out of malice, who fights against it, who works to suppress it. The Quranic threats, the fire, the wrath, the punishment, these are directed at the third category, and to some extent to the second. They are not directed at the first. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, clarifies the principle. He says, if the servants of God, when they were ignorant, had paused and had not denied, they would not have become disbelievers. Now the word over here is jahadu, yani denied, rejected, actively suppressed. Had they not done that, they would not have become disbelievers. Disbelief that warrants punishment is not mere ignorance. It is denial after knowledge, rejection after clarity. So let's now look at the contemporary application. Most of the world are actually Mustad'af. So let us consider the implications for our age. A person in Manchester, in Toronto, in Sydney, in somewhere like this, raised on a diet of media that presents Islam as terrorism or oppression, who has never once encountered the authentic teachings of Ahlulbayt and Quran, who has never met an actual Muslim who embodied the prophetic character, is this person an obstinate disbeliever, a kafir mu'annad, an enemy of God who deserves the fire? Or is this person Mustad'af, a victim of circumstance, someone who cannot devise a plan, nor can he be guided to the way? Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, addressed this directly. He said, disbelievers are of two types. One is the inculpable ignorant. These are the ones against whom the proof has not yet been established. And the majority of people in the world are of this type. If they die in their disbelief, they are not punished. Rather, salvation is hoped for them. And the references are in the write-up. The majority. Not a small exception, the majority. Imam Khamenei, may God protect him, extends this analysis to the modern context. He says, we have no enmity with non-Muslim nations. We are enemies with arrogance, or what we call istikbar. Many of these people living in the West, Islam has not reached their ears, nor has it reached them, or it has reached them in an inverted, distorted manner. These people are Mustad'af. Their account is separate from the account of the leaders of disbelief, of kufr. And the references in the write-up. Ayatullah Sistani, may God prolong his life, echoes this. He says, if he is not obstinate towards the truth, but rather his ignorance is due to inability and not negligence, then it is apparent that he will not be punished in the hereafter. And Ayatullah Jawadi Amali, may God protect him, captures the linguistic essence. He says, kufr in language, in Arabic language, means to cover. A kafir is someone who sees and recognizes the truth, but throws a curtain over it. Someone who has never seen the truth is not the complete manifestation of kafir in the Quranic sense that deserves the fire. And the reference for all of these is in the write-up. So why does this matter for our discussion of Taqiyyah? Because the shield is not meant for everyone. Taqiyyah is protection from hostile enemies, from the kafir mu'annad, who knows the truth and seeks to destroy it, from the tyrant who will kill the believer for his faith and his position, from the persecutor who hunts the followers of truth and of Ahlulbayt and of Quran and of Islam. Taqiyyah is not a posture of permanent suspicion toward every non-Muslim on earth. It is not a license to treat all of humanity as enemies. It is not a wall between the believer and the ordinary person who simply does not know. When the Quran says, except when you protect yourselves from them as a precaution, the them refers to those who pose a threat, the hostile, the malicious, the powerful who would use their power to crush faith and truth. It does not refer to your colleague at work who has never heard of Imam Ali or Prophet Muhammad properly. It does not refer to your neighbor who thinks that Shia is a type of cuisine. It does not refer to the billions of human beings who, in the words of Imam Khamenei, have received Islam in an inverted and distorted manner and are victims, not enemies. This distinction will become crucial when we reach the contemporary applications, where we discuss how to engage with the West, not through defensive hiding, but through what we call makarim al-akhlaq, the noble character that reveals the truth rather than concealing it. The shield is for enemies. For the Mustad'af, for the oppressed, we have a different obligation. To show them the truth they have never seen, in a form that they can recognize, through conduct that refutes the lies that they have been told. With this clarification in place, that the shield is for the enemies, not for the Mustad'af, the oppressed, we can now appreciate the full weight of what the Quran has established. So we have three Quranic witnesses, three proofs. We mention the chapter of the family of Imran, verse 28. The explicit permission clause permitting protective concealment in the face of danger. We then have the chapter of the bee, 16th chapter of the Quran, verse 106, the validation of Ammar ibn Yasir, proving that words spoken under compulsion do not nullify faith. And we have the chapter of the forgiver, Surah Al-Ghafir, 40th chapter of the Quran, verse 28, the model of the believer in Pharaoh's household, demonstrating that concealment can coexist with and even protect the highest levels of belief. This is not a Shia peculiarity. This is the Quran. The one who mocks Taqiyyah mocks these verses. And the one who claims that Taqiyyah is religiously sanctioned lying has not read the book he claims to be speaking about or follow. The one who uses Taqiyyah as a slur against the believer must first contend with Ammar ibn Yasir, with the believer of Pharaoh's family, and with the explicit words of God himself. We did not invent this, we inherited this, we preserve this, and we are not ashamed of it. The shield is Quranic, and tonight we learn how to carry it. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the linguistic proof. Taqiyyah and Taqwa share a root.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
So we've established the Quranic foundation. Now let us examine the word itself, because language is not arbitrary. In Arabic, the language of revelation, words carry their meanings in their bones. The root system that structures the language embeds concepts into syllabuses so that related words echo each other across centuries of use. And when we examine the word Taqiyyah, we discover something that should silence its critics forever. The Arabic root waqaya carries a single consistent meaning across all of its derivatives. To shield, to protect, to guard. From this root, Arabic derives firstly the word wiqaya, which means protection, guarding, shielding. The word used for protective equipment, for barriers, for anything that stands between a person and harm. Another word that's derived from that is taqwa, the most celebrated virtue in Islam, usually translated as piety or God awareness, but actually its linguistic meaning is to shield oneself from the displeasure of God. The muttaqi is the one who places a barrier between himself and divine anger, through obedience, through righteousness, and through careful avoidance of sin. And then you have a taqiyyah, to shield oneself from harm at the hands of persecutors. The muttaqi, in this sense, is the one who places a barrier between himself and those who would destroy him for his faith. The same root, the same meaning, the same act of shielding, but directed at different threats. Consider what this means. When the Quran commands us to have taqwa, it commands us to shield ourselves from His wrath, God's wrath, by obeying His commands. This is, of course, universally praised. No Muslim considered taqwa to be cowardice. No Muslim mocks the muttaqi for hiding from God's punishment. On the contrary, taqwa is the highest virtue, the criterion by which God distinguishes between human beings. In Quran, Surah Al-Hujurat, the chapter of the chambers, 49th chapter of the Quran, verse 13, God says, "Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous, atqakum, the one with the most taqwa," from the same root, waqaya. Now, when the same root produces taqiyyah, shielding oneself from the harm of persecutors, why should this suddenly become shameful? If it is noble to shield oneself from divine anger through obedience, why is it shameful to shield oneself from human violence through discretion? If the muttaqi who fears God is praised, why is the muttaqi who fears the tyrant mocked? The logic of the critics collapses under the weight of the language itself. Those who attack taqiyyah translate it as dissimulation or religiously sanctioned lying. They present it as a license for deception, a permission to say anything, a blank check for falsehood. This is not translation. This is slander. The word taqiyyah does not come from the root kadhaba, which means to lie. It does not come from the root ghashasha, which means to deceive. It does not come from the root kadha, which means to trick. It comes from the root waqaya, to shield. A shield is not a lie. A shield is a barrier. It does not create a false reality. It protects a true one. The soldier who raises a shield against an arrow is not lying to the archer. He's surviving. The believer who conceals his faith from those who would kill him for it is not lying about reality. He's protecting reality. The reality of his faith, the reality of his family, his community's survival, from those who would destroy it. This is not semantics. This is the difference between understanding a concept and caricaturing it. Let's now look at the testimony of the Imams. The linguistic connection is not merely an observation of grammarians. The Imams of Ahlulbayt themselves, the authoritative interpreters of Quran, taught this principle explicitly. Al-Khomeini dedicates an entire chapter of Al-Kafi to the subject of Taqiyyah, and the narrations contained therein leave no room for doubt about its centrality to the faith. And we've gone through some of these hadith before. Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, has declared, "Taqiyyah is my religion and the religion of my forefathers, and there is no faith for the one who has no taqiyyah." References, of course, in the write-up. But I want you to consider the weight of this statement. The Imam does not say taqiyyah is permitted. He does not say it is tolerated. He says it is his religion and the religion of his forefathers, meaning the Prophet himself, Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, Imam Sajjad, Imam Baqir, all of them. Peace and blessings be upon all of them. And then he inverts the accusation the enemies made. They say the one who practices Taqiyyah has no real faith. He is a hypocrite and a liar. The Imam says the opposite. There is no faith for the one who has no Taqiyyah. A person without Taqiyyah is not more faithful. He is faithless. Because faith includes and requires wisdom. Faith includes the protection of what is sacred. Faith includes the refusal to throw pearls before swine, to hand the enemy the weapons with which to destroy you. And then you have the 9/10 of religion. In another narration, Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, quantifies the matter. He says, 9/10 of religion is in Taqiyyah, and there is no religion for the one who has no Taqiyyah. 9/10. This is not a minor dispensation. This is not an embarrassing exception that we wish we could hide. According to the Imam, the overwhelming majority of practical religion in an era of persecution and danger consists of knowing when to speak and when to remain silent, when to reveal and when to conceal, when to stand exposed and when to take shelter. Why 9/10? Because the Shia have always lived under threat. From the time of Imam Ali to the time of Imam al-Askari, the followers of Ahlulbayt were hunted, imprisoned, tortured and killed. To survive, to preserve the teachings, to raise the next generation, to maintain the community, required constant vigilance. The one who could not navigate this terrain did not survive to pass on the faith. 9/10 of religion in such conditions is the wisdom of survival. And then you have the shield of the believer. Imam al-Baqir, peace and blessings be upon him, employed the very metaphor that we've been developing. Imam Baqir says, and all of the references of course are in the write-up, Imam Baqir said, Taqiyyah is the shield of the believer, and there is no faith for the one who has no Taqiyyah. The word used is turs, a shield. The same word that is used for the physical shield that a warrior carries into battle. The Imam does not say Taqiyyah is a mask. He does not say it is a disguise. He says it is a shield. A mask creates a false identity. A shield protects a true one. A disguise deceives about who you are. A shield preserves who you are from those who would destroy you. This is the image from the Imam himself that he chose, and it is the image we carry forward tonight. Taqiyyah as the shield of the believer. And then you have the completion of faith. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, also said, the one who has no Taqiyyah has no faith, and indeed the most noble of you in the sight of God is the one who acts most upon Taqiyyah. The reference is in the write-up. Notice how the Imam echoes the Quranic verse we cited earlier. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous, at-Taqwa, of you, from the chapter of the chambers. But the Imam applies it to Taqiyyah. The Quran says the most noble is the one with the most Taqwa. The Imam says the most noble is the one who acts upon Taqiyyah. Because both are from the same root. Both are forms of the same protection. Both are expressions of the same wisdom that shields what is sacred from what would destroy it. And Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, gave practical instruction to his companions, saying, mix with them outwardly and differ from them inwardly when the rule is childish, tyrannical or immature. And the reference, of course, in the write-up. The outward and the inward. The external conduct, what we call the baraniyah, and the jawaniyah, which is the internal reality. The Imam instructs his followers to maintain the distinction, to navigate the external world with wisdom, while preserving the internal truth with vigilance. And he specifies the condition, when the rule is childish, meaning tyrannical, immature, oppressive, when the political authority cannot be trusted with the truth, when exposure means destruction. This is not permanent dispensation. This is strategic survival under tyranny. When the tyranny ends, when the rule is just, when the danger passes, the instructions change. The external and the internal can align. The shield can be lowered. But while the tyranny persists, the shield remains raised. Let's now look at the scholar's testimony. Allama Tabatabai, may God rest his pure soul, draws this connection explicitly in Al-Mizan. He says, Taqiyyah and Taqwa are from the same origin, which is Waqiyyah, which means protection. Taqwa is protecting the soul from the anger of God by fulfilling his commands and avoiding his prohibitions. Taqiyyah is protecting the soul from the harm of enemies by outwardly displaying what agrees with them while preserving faith inwardly. The reference is in the write-up. One origin, two applications. The same act of protection, turned toward God in one case, toward the tyrant in another. Shaykh Mutahhari, may God rest his pure soul, reinforces this by saying, Taqiyyah is from the root wiqayah, meaning to protect oneself. Just as taqwa means protecting oneself from the punishment of God, Taqiyyah means protecting oneself from the harm of the enemy. These two concepts are two branches of the single tree. The reference, of course, is in the write-up. Two branches of a single tree. The one who has taqwa protects his soul from God's anger by righteous conduct. The one who practices taqiyyah protects his soul from the enemy's sword by wise discretion. Both are engaged in the same essential act, wiqayah, shielding what is precious from what would destroy it. Now, this linguistic analysis is not merely academic, it has practical consequences. If taqiyyah were truly lying, it would be a sin, because lying is forbidden in Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family and his righteous companions, has said, beware of lying, for lying leads to wickedness. If taqiyyah were lying, it would contradict the Quran's permission. God cannot permit that which he forbids. The verses we examined from Surah Al-Imran, from Surah Al-Nahl and from Surah Al-Ghafir would be commanding Muslims to sin. But taqiyyah is not lying, it is shielding. And shielding is not forbidden, it is the very essence of taqwa, the virtue that God praises above all others. The critics have confused categories. They have taken a concept rooted in protection and relabeled it as deception. They have taken a permission for survival and twisted it into a license for falsehood. The language itself refutes them. Waqayah does not mean to lie, it means to protect. And protection of faith, of family, of community, of life, it is not a sin, rather it is a duty. And here we must make a crucial distinction. Kitman versus kidhab, and we'll come to what they mean momentarily. So we have established that taqiyyah is Quranic. We have shown that it shares its root with taqwa, that both are forms of shielding, both expressions of the same protective wisdom. But the accusations persist, and it takes a very specific form. Taqiyyah is lying. The Shia are permitted to lie about their beliefs. Therefore nothing they say can be trusted. This accusation is not merely wrong, it is linguistically ignorant. And tonight we dismantle it at the level of Arabic itself. Two words, two realities. The Arabic language, the language of the Quran, the language of precision, literally the word Arabic means clear, precise, distinguishes between two very different acts. You have an act called kitman, which is to conceal, to withhold or to cover, and kidhab, which means to lie, to fabricate, to state that which is false. They're not synonyms, they're not interchangeable. They describe fundamentally different moral acts. Kitman is the act of not revealing. The one who practices kitman does not manufacture a false reality. He does not invent beliefs that he does not hold. He does not claim to worship idols when he worships God. He simply withholds. He remains silent. He redirects. He gives an answer that is true but incomplete. An answer that protects the kernel without fabricating a lie. Consider. If someone asks you a question and you say, I would prefer not to discuss that. Have you lied? No, of course you haven't. You have concealed. You have practiced kitman. The questioner has learnt nothing false from you. He has simply learnt nothing at all. Or consider, if a hostile interrogator asks you, are you a Shia? And you respond, I am a Muslim who follows the Quran and the Sunnah. Have you lied? No, you have not. Every word you have said is true. You have simply not disclosed the full picture. You have given a true answer that does not expose you to danger. This is kitman. This is what Taqiyyah actually involves. Kadhab is the act of stating falsehood. The one who practices kadhab fabricates. For example, he says X is true when he knows that X is false. He creates a false reality in the mind of the listener. He deceives by not withholding but by manufacturing. If the same interrogator asks, are you a Shia? And you respond, no, I hate the Shia, I curse Ali and his family. This is kadhab. You have not merely concealed, you have fabricated. You have placed a falsehood into the world. And this, let us be absolutely clear, is not what Taqiyyah permits in ordinary circumstances. Let's look at the prophetic model of silence and redirection. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family and righteous companions, himself taught the art of kitman without kadhab, concealing without fabrication. When he made the hijrah to Medina, he and Abu Bakr passed through the desert. People along the way asked, who is this man with you? Abu Bakr responded, this is a man who guides me on the way. And the reference is in the write-up. The questioners assumed he meant a guide through the desert roads. Abu Bakr meant the guide to the path of God. Every word was true. Nothing was fabricated. But the full reality was concealed. This is the model. This is how the companions understood protective speech. Not lying, layering. Not fabrication, but strategic ambiguity. Now here's a note for the honest inquirer. We should acknowledge there are those who ask about Taqiyyah not from malice but from genuine confusion. They have heard the accusation, they have seen it repeated, they do not know the Arabic, they have never read Al-Kafi or Al-Mizan or even the Quran. They simply want to understand. To these sincere seekers we say, your question is welcome and here is the answer. Taqiyyah is not a program of universal deception. It is a very specific permission for very specific circumstances. Circumstances of genuine danger, where the choice is between concealment and destruction. The ordinary Muslim, living his life, interacting with his neighbors, working with his colleagues, raising his children, this person is not walking around in a state of permanent taqiyyah, lying about everything to everyone. He is simply a Muslim. His yes means yes. His no means no. His word is his bond. But if, God forbid, he finds himself in a situation where revealing his faith would mean death, or the destruction of his family, or the annihilation of his community, then the Quran has given him permission to shield himself. Not to become a liar, not to fabricate a false identity, but to withhold what the enemy has no right to demand. This is kitman, this is Taqiyyah, this is the shield. Please give me a salawat and we move to the art of strategic ambiguity, or what we call Tawriyah.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
So all that we have said, the scholars, they call this technique Tawriyah. The use of words that are technically true but carry a meaning different from what the listener assumes. In an earlier session in this sub-series, I believe session 51, maybe 4 weeks ago, where we studied the life of the third deputy, Hussein ibn Ruh al-Nawbakhti, we examined this art in great detail. Tonight we're going to recall it very briefly to establish the distinction between Tawriyah and lying. So first, the prophetic precedent, we are from water. The Prophet Muhammad himself, peace and blessings be upon him, his family and his righteous companions, taught this art during the hijrah to Medina. As he and Abu Bakr travelled through the desert, evading the bounty hunters of Quraysh, they encountered a Bedouin man who asked, "Who are you? Where are you from?" To reveal their identity would mean death. To claim they were from a different tribe would be a lie. So the Prophet replied with a very simple, very singular phrase. He said, We are from water. Nahnu min al-ma'. And the reference, of course, is in the write-ups, and this is common across both Shia and Sunni. The Bedouin, interpreting this through his tribal knowledge, assumed they meant they were from the tribe of Ma'as-Sama', or from a region known for its wells. He let them pass. But the Prophet intended the Quranic reality that humanity itself is created from water. In Quran, Surah Al-Anbiya, the chapter of the Prophets, 21st chapter of the Quran, verse 30, God says, "And we made from water every living thing." Every word the Prophet said was true, nothing was fabricated. But the full reality was concealed. This is Tawriyah. Let's remember and remind ourselves of the deputies application. The Muslims have agreed. Hussein ibn Ruh al-Nawbakhti wielded the same wand of words in the Abbasid court, as we detailed in the previous session 51. A gathering was convened in the presence of Abbasid officials and Sunni scholars. The enemies of Ahlulbayt were attempting to trap him into making a statement that would expose him as the secret head of the Shia network, which will lead to his execution and the dismantling of the entire organization. Hussein ibn Ruh preempted them. In that crowded assembly, he rose and made a public declaration saying, and Sheikh al-Tusi quotes, Hussein ibn Ruh declared in a crowded gathering, "The Muslims have agreed by consensus that the best of this community after its prophet, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, his family and righteous companions, is Abu Bakr, then Umar, then Uthman, and then Ali." The Shia attendees were horrified. They thought their deputy had essentially apostatized. But notice the precision of his statement. He did not say, "I believe the best of this community is Abu Bakr." He said, "The Muslims have agreed by consensus that the best of this community is..." This is Tawriyah. He stated a fact about what the majority of Muslims publicly claim to believe. The Sunni officials heard it as a personal confession of faith. But the statement itself was a description of a public opinion, not a declaration of his own heart. When the confused Shia approached him privately, demanding an explanation, he replied, "Woe to you! I only said this to deflect the sword from you. Had it not been for that statement, I would have been killed and you would have been killed." And the references are all in the write-up. He used the wand of words to deflect the physical sword of the tyrant. This is the difference between Tawriyah and lying. The liar says X is true when he knows that X is false. He manufactures a false reality in the mind of the listener. The practitioner of Tawriyah says something that is true, but the listener, interpreting through his own assumptions, draws a conclusion that the speaker did not explicitly state. The Prophet did not lie when he said we are from water. Every human being is from water. Hussein ibn Ruh did not lie when he said the Muslims have agreed by consensus. He was describing public opinion, not his personal belief. Shaykh Mutahhari, in his analysis of Islamic ethics, explains the purpose of this discipline. He says, "So that your soul does not become habituated to lying in situations where you are compelled to conceal the truth, let one meaning cross your mind while you bring something else to your tongue. The name of this is Tawriyah. Never confront your mind directly with a lie, so that it does not become accustomed to lying." And the references in the write-up. The soul must be protected from the habit of lying and falsehood. Even in extreme circumstances, the believer trains himself to speak the truth always. Layered truth, ambiguous truth, truth that conceals while not fabricating, rather than to manufacture lies. This is the discipline of the tongue that Taqiyyah demands. Let's now look at the jurisprudential hierarchy, Tawriyah before lying. Please give me a salawat, and then we have a primer on jurisprudential reasoning.
اللهم صل على محمد.
So before examining the specific rulings on Tawriyah, we must understand how Islamic jurisprudence operates. This is not a mere academic formality. It is essential for grasping why scholars may differ and what that means for the believer. So there are 5 categories of action, what we call al-ahkam al-khamsa. Every human action falls into one of 5 categories. Either it is wajib or obligatory, it must be performed, and it's a sin to omit it. It is potentially mustahab or recommended. It is rewarded if it is performed, but there is no sin if it's omitted. You have mubah, which is permissible, neither rewarded nor punished. You have makruh, which is disliked. It's better to avoid, no sin if performed. And haram, forbidden, must be avoided, and it is a sin to perform. When a scholar issues a ruling, they are placing an action into one of these categories, based on their analysis of Quran, the Sunnah of the Prophet, the teachings of Ahlulbayt, the science of Usul al-Fiqh, and many other disciplines, rational principles. You then have the notion of obligatory precaution, what we call ihtiyat wajib, and recommended precaution, ihtiyat mustahab. So when you see the phrase ihtiyat wajib in a scholar's ruling, it means the precautionary position is obligatory. You must follow this unless you refer to another qualified marja who rules otherwise. When you see ihtiyat mustahab, it means it's better to be cautious but not strictly required. The distinction matters greatly. When three of the most followed living maraja rule that attempting Tawriyah is ihtiyat wajib, they are saying this is not optional piety, it is the required course of action. Now you have the notion of the stronger position, al-aqwa, versus the more precautionary position, which is known as al-ahwat. In jurisprudential texts, you will encounter two key phrases. Al-aqwa, the stronger position, which is based on textual evidence, and al-ahwat, the more precautionary position. Sometimes they align, sometimes they diverge. A scholar might say, the stronger position is based on the text, the stronger position based on the text is X, but the more precautionary position is Y. This reflects the reality that jurisprudence involves weighing evidence, and scholars may reach different conclusions while acknowledging the merit in alternate views. Understanding this framework prevents the simplistic error of cherry-picking one phrase from a ruling while ignoring its full context. So now we look at the ontological consensus. Tawriyah is not lying. Before debating whether Tawriyah is obligatory, we must establish what Tawriyah is. On this point, there is no disagreement among the scholars. Tawriyah is not lying. Tawriyah, sometimes it's known as iham, is the use of language that conveys one meaning to the listener while the speaker intends another valid meaning. The speaker does not utter a falsehood. Rather, they employ the natural ambiguity of language to protect themselves or others from harm. The great Ayatullah al-Khoi, may God rest his soul, established the definitive position in his Misbah al-Faqaha. There is no doubt that Tawriyah is excluded from the legal subject of lying, and the references in the write-up. He explained that lying is realized when the speaker's true intention contradicts reality, not merely when the outward wording could be misunderstood. Accordingly, Tawriyah, where the true intention accords with reality, is not a form of lying. This is a matter of ontology, the very nature of what constitutes a lie. A lie requires the speaker to state what they know to be false. In Tawriyah, the speaker states what they know to be true according to one valid meaning of their words, even if the listener understands differently. Imam Khamenei's explanation. The leader of the Islamic Revolution, Imam Khamenei, may God protect him, provides the standard definition in his Risaleh Amuzashi. He says, Tawriyah is to speak a statement whose apparent meaning is contrary to reality, but the speaker's intended meaning is something else which corresponds to reality. References in the write-up. In his Arabic jurisprudential responses, he renders the definition, Tawriyah, that he intends by his speech a meaning other than what the addressee understands from what the wording allows. This is crucial. Tawriyah is classified as Sadiq, as an act of truthfulness. The truth is located in the speaker's intended meaning, not the listener's apparent understanding or misunderstanding. It belongs to an entirely different category to lying. Why does this matter? The accusation that Taqiyyah makes Shia liars collapses at this first hurdle. The primary mechanism available to the believer, Tawriyah, is not lying at all. It is a sophisticated use of language that preserves both safety and truthfulness simultaneously. Having established that Tawriyah is not lying, we now examine what the living maraji' say about its use. The contemporary consensus is striking in its uniformity. First of all, Imam Khamenei. His ruling on this subject is, if a person has no choice but to lie in order to preserve life, property, or honor of themselves or another, lying is not forbidden. Rather, sometimes it is obligatory. However, if one is able to use Tawriyah, obligatory precaution dictates that one must use Tawriyah. The reference is in the write-up. Ayatullah Sistani, he says, lying is permissible for repelling harm from oneself or another believer. Even swearing an oath on it is permissible. And lying is permissible for reconciliation between believers. However, by obligatory precaution, in these two cases, as long as Tawriyah is possible, one should not lie. Reference, of course, is in the write-up. And then you have Ayatollah Makarim Shirazi. He says, if it is possible to escape from lying through Tawriyah, obligatory precaution dictates that one must use this method. And the reference also is in the write-up. So what's the significance of this? 3 of the most widely followed living maraji in the Shia world, representing tens of millions of followers across Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Persian Gulf, beyond, England, everywhere, have all ruled that Tawriyah is not merely recommended, but obligatorily precautionary. This means that for the vast majority of practicing Shia Muslims today, the instruction from their religious authority is very clear. Seek the path of truthfulness first. Even when necessity permits concealment, the believer is obligated to attempt the method that preserves both safety and truthfulness. With that having been said, how then can anyone claim this is a community of liars? The very authorities who guide this community have made the avoidance of lying a matter of obligatory precaution. And then we need to understand Imam Khomeini's position and the full context. Please give me a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So no discussion on this topic would be complete without addressing Imam Khomeini's position, which has sometimes been cited inaccurately to suggest that Tawriyah is optional or unimportant. A careful examination of his actual ruling reveals a far more nuanced picture. So first of all, the primary ruling in the Book of Oaths. In Tahrir al-Wasila, Volume 2, the Book of Oaths, Issue 17, Imam Khomeini writes, the stronger position, al-Aqwa, is that Tawriyah is not obligatory, even though it is the better path. The reference is in the write-up. Now, notice 3 critical elements. He uses the word al-Aqwa, the stronger position based on textual evidence, not a definitive fatwa that closes the matter. He explicitly acknowledges that Tawriyah is ahsanuha, the better, the more excellent path. He addresses the legal obligation, not the ethical recommendation. And remember, books like Tahrir al-Wasila, some people try and just read them without having any real understanding. Tahrir al-Wasila are heavy books of fiqh. You can't just read them like you read a novel or an article. Let's look at the contextual limitation in this. Even more revealing is Imam Khomeini's discussion in Volume 1, in the section on what we call compulsion, ikrah, in contracts. Here he explains when his leniency applies. He says, it is apparent that the validity of compulsion does not require the impossibility of escape through Tawriyah. One is still considered compelled if escape through Tawriyah was difficult and there was a possibility of falling into harm. However, if he was aware of Tawriyah and it was easy for him without any problem, then there is a disagreement, or ishkal as we say. This passage is actually transformative. Imam Khomeini is not saying skip Tawriyah whenever you want. He's making a contextual distinction. So if you're in your situation, if Tawriyah is difficult or risky, then Imam Khomeini's ruling is there is no strict obligation to attempt it first. In your situation, if Tawriyah is easy and accessible, then there is ishkal, disagreement, meaning that, implying that it may be required. The key phrase over here is, if escape through Tawriyah was difficult and there was a possibility of falling into harm, then you can use Tawriyah. So why would Imam Khomeini, himself a man of uncompromising principle, allow this flexibility? Because he understood the reality of extreme duress. Consider the situations he was addressing. A scholar being interrogated by the Shah's notorious Sabak. A believer hiding, a fugitive from oppressors. A revolutionary facing torture. In such moments, the human mind does not operate with the calm precision of a courtroom. To demand perfect linguistic craftsmanship from someone whose life hangs by a thread might be setting them up for failure or even death. Imam Khomeini's ruling accounts for human frailty without abandoning ethical aspiration. He says, in extreme difficulty, the absence of Tawriyah does not invalidate the necessity. But he also says, Tawriyah remains the better path. And he further implies, when Tawriyah is actually accessible, the calculus changes. This is not laxity, this is wisdom. So now we arrive at the deepest layer of this discussion. Why is Islamic law structured in this way? The answer lies in the very nature of the divine legislator and his relationship with his creation. The Quran establishes three foundational principles that govern all of Islamic law. These are not mere comforting words, they are legislative principles, what we call qawa'id fiqhiyya, that shape how every ruling is applied. The first is from Surah Al-Hajj, the chapter of the pilgrimage, 22nd chapter of the Quran, where Allah says, and He has not placed upon you in the religion any difficulty, and the word used is haraj. The second is from Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran. The verse from Surah Al-Hajj, was verse 78. From Surah Al-Baqarah, it's verse 185, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, God intends for you ease and does not intend for you hardship. And the third is also from Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, and this time it's verse 286, where God says, God does not burden a soul beyond its capacity. Now, how do our scholars understand these verses? Let us turn to two of the greatest exegetes of our time. First of all, Allama Tabatabai in Al-Mizan. On the first verse from Surah Al-Hajj, Allama Tabatabai writes, this language is the language of declaring transcendence, tanzih, indicating that He, the Exalted, did not legislate any ruling that necessitates hardship or constriction upon His servants. Therefore, whenever a ruling becomes difficult or haraji, it is lifted from the person obligated. This is a general rule applicable across all chapters of jurisprudence. The references in the write-up. So do you hear what Allama is saying? Whenever a ruling becomes a source of genuine hardship, it is lifted. Not bent, not adjusted, lifted entirely. And this is not an exception, it is a general rule across all of fiqh. In the second verse, Surah Al-Baqarah 185, he explains, the sentence, God intends for you ease, is the rationale for the previous concession regarding the sick and the traveller. Therefore, if the obligation becomes arduous and difficult, it falls from the servant, because God does not intend hardship. The principle, the verse of course is talking about fasting, the principle extends beyond fasting. It is the very logic of divine legislation. When hardship arises, the obligation falls. And on the third verse, again Surah Al-Baqarah verse 286, Allah cuts to the very heart of the matter. He says, Al-Wus'a refers to energy and capacity. This verse negates the obligation of what is unbearable. For imposing a duty that a human cannot encompass or has no power over is foolishness and injustice, and God, glory be to him, is free from that. So listen to what he's saying. To demand the impossible is not piety. It is foolishness. It is oppression. It is dhulm. And God is transcendent and purified from such injustice. This is theology with teeth. Then you have Ayatullah Jawadi Amali in Tafsir Tasneem. Let's see how he applies these principles. On the first verse from Surah Al-Hajj, 22nd chapter of the Quran, verse 78, Ayatullah Jawadi writes, "The religion of Islam is a religion of magnanimity and ease. God, in legislating the laws, has considered the power and endurance of those obligated. Haraj means constriction and tightness that is habitually difficult to bear. The negation of haraj in this verse is the negation of the ruling itself, meaning any ruling that causes haraj has not been enacted in Islam." The reference is in the write-up. Magnanimity and ease. This is not a religion that corners you. This is not a system that traps you. On the second verse, Surah Al-Baqarah, second chapter of the Quran, verse 185, Ayatullah Jawadi explains, "The legislative will of God is based on ease. Divine laws are for human perfection, not for his suffering and toil. If a ruling in specific conditions like mortal danger or illness causes hardship, that ruling is removed. Yusr, the word yusr here, means that the rulings of religion are accompanied by flexibility and facility, and there is no dead end." Listen to that phrase. There is no dead end. The religion does not corner you. It does not trap you between death and damnation. There is always a way. And now on the third verse, Surah Al-Baqarah again, verse 286, Ayatullah Jawadi Amali makes a direct connection to Taqiyyah. He says, "God has the right to be worshipped, but he demands this right only to the extent of the servant's capacity." The word used is wusr. Wusr means the amount of power, the usage of which does not cause hardship or harm. In the case of Taqiyyah, when declaring one's faith is outside of one's capacity, meaning it could lead to murder or problems like this, the obligation falls. This demonstrates the master's compassion toward the servant. The reference is, of course, in the write-up. The obligation falls, not because God's right to be worshipped has diminished, not because the truth has become less true, but because God in his infinite mercy does not demand from his servant what would destroy that servant. The tender mercy of the master toward his slave. This is what Taqiyyah is rooted in, not deception, not cowardice, but the mercy of a Lord who knows his creation and refuses to break it. Let's now... The prophets and the Imams as revolutionary realists. So this is not a peripheral principle. It reflects the very character of prophethood and imamah. The Prophet Muhammad instructed us, "Make things easy and do not make them difficult. Give glad tidings and do not drive people away." And the references are all in the write-up. The prophets and the Imams were not detached idealists living in ivory towers. They were revolutionaries who understood the crushing weight of oppression, the terror of persecution, the limits of human endurance under torture. They calibrated their teachings to human capacity, not to some impossible ideal that would crush souls, rather than elevate them. Imam Khomeini himself embodied this synthesis, revolutionary in principle, realist in application. He did not lower the standards of Islam. He understood that true standards must be achievable, or they become instruments of despair rather than paths to salvation. Now over here we must make a critical warning. Hardship has a jurisprudential meaning. This mercy, however, is not a blank check. It has a very specific scope, and we must understand that scope to honor it properly. Now, before anyone takes these principles and runs in the entirely wrong direction, we must be absolutely clear about something. The principle of no burden beyond capacity is not a blank check to abandon obligations whenever we find them inconvenient. When the scholars speak of haraj and usr, hardship and difficulty, they are using technical jurisprudential terms with very specific meanings. They are referring to genuine threat to life, like the believer facing execution but declaring his faith. Severe illness, where performing an obligation would cause serious medical harm. And true impossibility, where the action literally cannot be performed. They are not referring to discomfort. Fasting is difficult, but that difficulty does not lift the obligation. Inconvenience. Waking for the Fajr and morning prayer is hard, but that hardship does not permit abandoning it. Self-imposed difficulty. The smoker who finds fasting unbearable has created his own problem. His addiction does not transform a universal obligation into a personal exemption. The distinction is crucial. The person who says, fasting is too hard for me because I smoke, and God does not burden a soul beyond its capacity, so I don't have to fast. This person has fundamentally misunderstood the principle. The haraj that lifts an obligation is objective hardship recognized by the Sharia, not subjective discomfort determined by the individual. A traveler is genuinely exempt from fasting, not because travel is hard in some vague sense, but because the Sharia itself has designated travel as a recognized category of exemptions. A person with diabetes whose doctor confirms that fasting would endanger their health is exempt, because genuine medical necessity is a recognized category. But the person who simply finds an obligation unpleasant, the one who would rather sleep than pray, the one whose lifestyle choices have made obedience difficult, these are not cases of what we call haraj. These are cases of nafs, the ego resisting its discipline. The concession exists for genuine necessity, not for convenience. And here is the deeper point. The very fact that these dispensations are limited is what makes them meaningful. If everyone could simply opt out of any obligation they found difficult, there would be no religion left, there would be no law left. The dispensation for the genuinely endangered believer has value precisely because it is not available to the merely lazy one. The person of Taqwa understands this. They do not look for loopholes. They do not twist the principles of mercy into excuses for abandonment. They fulfill their obligations to the best of their ability, and they accept the genuine dispensations with gratitude when true necessity arises, not before. And equality is not equivalence. So with that warning firmly in place, we can now appreciate the deeper wisdom of this principle. True justice does not mean treating everyone identically. It means treating each according to their nature and their capacity. To demand from a person under torture the same linguistic precision as someone in calm contemplation is not justice. It is cruelty disguised as piety. To require the same verbal dexterity from a terrified believer facing execution as from a scholar in his study is not upholding standards. It is ignoring the reality that God himself has acknowledged. But equally, and this is the balance, to allow the comfortable person to claim the exemption meant for the endangered is not mercy. It is corruption of the law. The law is calibrated to human capacity precisely because it comes from the one who created that capacity. This is not a deficiency in the law, rather it is its perfection. And this is precisely what elevates those who follow it, because they are following the best way, not an impossible way. The one who practices Tawriyah when able and resorts to concealment only when Tawriyah is beyond reach is walking the path that God himself has designated as the path of wisdom. The one who fulfills obligations when able and accepts dispensations only when genuine necessity arises is walking that same path. This is the balance of Islam: rigor without cruelty and mercy without laxity. And this framework is not an invention of later jurists. It is the practice of the prophets and the Imams themselves. Consider Prophet Abraham, peace and blessings be upon him. When the idolaters demanded to know who had destroyed their idols, he replied. And Quran, this is from Quran, Surah Al-Anbiya, the chapter of the prophets, 21st chapter of the Quran, verse 63. Allah says, he, Ibrahim, said, rather this big one did it, so ask them if they can speak. So did Abraham lie? The exegetes explained, he made a conditional statement. He did it if they can speak. Since they cannot speak, the condition fails. The pagans heard, he did it. But Ibrahim meant, ask them, and when they cannot answer, you will have your proof. This is Tawriyah. Every word was true. The listeners drew their own false conclusion. The Prophet did not need to lie. He found the truth that protected. And this is the model the scholars preserve. Find the truth first. Craft the statement that your heart can stand behind. Resort to fabrication only and only and only when no other path remains. And even then, only to repel genuine harm. Please give me a salawat and we move to the hard limit when concealment becomes forbidden.
اللهم صل على محمد
Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, jurisprudential.
But here is where the critics fail to read the full tradition. Taqiyyah is not a blank check. It is not permission to say anything under any circumstances. The Imams themselves set boundaries, hard limits, beyond which Taqiyyah becomes betrayal. Imam al-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, declared, Taqiyyah was only instituted to preserve blood. But if Taqiyyah itself reaches the point of causing blood to be shed, then there is no Taqiyyah. The reference is in the write-up. This is the governing principle. Taqiyyah exists to protect. The moment it would destroy, the moment your silence causes an innocent person to be killed, the moment your concealment enables a crime against the faith or humanity, Taqiyyah is not merely suspended, it becomes forbidden. The shield exists to preserve life. You cannot use the shield as a weapon to take it. Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, articulated the second boundary with characteristic clarity. He said, lacking power is an excuse, but if we acquire the power, Taqiyyah becomes forbidden. The reference is in the write-up. This transforms our understanding. Taqiyyah is not a permanent posture. It is not a lifestyle. It is a response to specific conditions. The conditions of inability. When you lack the capacity to resist openly, concealment is permitted, even obligatory. But when the capacity exists, when the power to speak and act has been granted, then Taqiyyah ceases to be a virtue and it becomes a vice. The one who has the power to defend the truth and chooses silence is not practicing Taqiyyah. Such a person is practicing cowardice. Let's now look at the Ali Hassan Hussein distinction. Consider the 25 years of silence maintained by the commander of the faithful, Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace and blessings be upon him. This was not the silence of a man with nothing to say. It was the silence of a man holding a shield over the entire ummah. He himself described this period, not with bitterness, but with the precision of one who understood exactly what he was doing. He said, I remained patient while there was a thorn in my eye and a bone in my throat. Why did he endure this? Because he understood that the young tree of Islam was still fragile. Had he drawn the sword to claim his right, the friction would have sparked a fire that consumed the entire forest. The community would have been torn apart before it had taken root. This is the highest form of Taqiyyah, what we might call the Imamic silence. The Imam did not lose his right through silence, he exercised his duty through silence. It is the choice to let one's own heart It is the choice to let one's own heart bleed so that the blood of the community is not spilt. It extends the shield beyond the self to cover an entire civilization. He protected the unity of the Muslims because he knew that without a community, there would be no one left to receive the truth. And this pattern, silence when silence preserves, speech when speech becomes obligatory, was inherited by his sons. We touched on the example very briefly last week in session 54, when we examined the false dawn. Let us briefly recall it now, for it illuminates the boundary we are discussing. Imam Hassan, peace and blessings be upon him, made a treaty with Muawiyah. He withdrew from open confrontation. He practiced what we might call strategic patience, a form of Taqiyyah at the political level. Why? Because Muawiyah, for all his corruption, maintained the outward shell of Islam. He prayed, he fasted, he did not openly call people to abandon the Sharia. He corrupted the kernel, the spiritual and political truth of wilayah, but preserving the shell, the external structures of Islamic practice. In such conditions, the Imam judged that open war would destroy the community without achieving the goal. The kernel could be preserved through patience, even as the shell was being hollowed out. But Yazid was different. Yazid did not merely corrupt the kernel. He sought to destroy both the kernel and the shell. He mocked the prayer. He drank openly. He demanded not mere political submission, but the legitimization of his rule by the family of the Prophet. A legitimization that would have annihilated the very meaning of Islam. And so Imam Hussein, peace and blessings be upon him, rose. He did not practice Taqiyyah. He could not. Because in that moment, Taqiyyah would not have preserved the religion. It would have buried it. Silence would not have protected the kernel. It would have handed the enemy the shovel to dig its grave. This is the lie. When the shell is being corrupted, but the kernel can still be preserved through patience, Taqiyyah is permitted. When both the shell and the kernel are under assault, when the very foundations of the religion face annihilation, Taqiyyah becomes forbidden and resistance becomes obligatory. So from these foundations, the scholars derive the conditions under which Taqiyyah is forbidden. Firstly, when your silence would cause innocent blood to be shed. If your concealment enables murder, oppression, or injustice against others, you have crossed the line. Taqiyyah exists to preserve life, not to become complicit in its destruction. Second, when the core of the religion is under open attack. If the enemy seeks not merely political power, but the annihilation of Tawheed, of prophethood, of wilayah itself, then silence is not protection, it is surrender. Third, when you possess the capacity to resist. If God has granted you the power, the platform, the resources, the safety to speak, and you choose silence out of comfort rather than necessity, you have abandoned your post. And fourth, when a qualified authority issues a ruling that requires public stance, when the Marja'iyyah declares a matter to be of existential importance, for example the fatwa against Daesh or the defense of the oppressed, the individual's personal taqiyyah is overridden by the collective obligation. These are not arbitrary rules. They are the logical extension of the principle. Taqiyyah is a means, not an end. The end is the preservation and advancement of the truth. The end is Allah. When taqiyyah serves that end, it is obligatory. When it betrays that end or would harm that end, it is forbidden. And the test? Would the Imam approve? Here is a practical test that the scholars offer. Before any act of taqiyyah, ask yourself, if Imam al-Sadiq were watching, would he approve of what I'm about to say or do? If the answer is yes, and of course you have to be honest with yourself, if the answer is yes, if you are protecting life, protecting family, protecting the community, protecting sacred knowledge from those who would destroy it, then proceed. If the answer is no, if you are using taqiyyah as an excuse for cowardice, for abandoning principle, for gaining worldly advantage through deception, then you have left the path. Taqiyyah is not a license for opportunism. It is not a tool for climbing social ladders by pretending to be what you are not. It is not permission to deny your identity when the only cost of honesty is discomfort. Taqiyyah is the shield of the believer under genuine threat. It is the fortress of the one who would be killed for his faith. It is the protection of the kernel when the enemies are at the gate. Use it for anything else, and you have betrayed its purpose. So when the critic says, Taqiyyah is lying, we respond, no, Taqiyyah is shielding. Lying is the fabrication of falsehood. Taqiyyah is the concealment of truth. Lying creates a false reality in the mind of the listener. Taqiyyah simply refuses to hand the listener a weapon. Lying is the act of a munafiq, a hypocrite, who says, I believe, while his heart rejects. Taqiyyah is the act of a believer, a mu'min, who guards what he believes from those who would destroy it. The Prophet permitted it, the Quran enshrines it. The Imams taught it, the scholars codified it. And the one who cannot distinguish between kitman or concealment and kidhab, fabrication, has no business lecturing anyone about Arabic grammar, about Islam, about taqiyyah, about ethics, about anything. And the lesson, 3 principles for the waiter. So we covered a lot of ground tonight. Before we close, let us distill the essence into principles that can be carried forward, not merely as knowledge, but as practice. The first principle, the shield protects truth. It does not replace it. Taqiyyah exists to preserve what is real, not to create what is false. The believer who practices Taqiyyah is not building an alternative identity. He is not becoming someone else. He is guarding who he truly is from those who would destroy it. This means that Taqiyyah is by design always temporary. It is always in the service of a future unveiling. The believer of Prophet's household concealed, but when the moment came, he revealed, he spoke. Hussein ibn Ruh deflected the swords with words, but the organization he protected eventually built the Hawza, the Marja'iyyah, the institutions that today proclaim the truth openly. Ask yourself, is my concealment protecting something real that will one day emerge? Or have I made the shield into a permanent home, forgetting that I was supposed to be guarding a treasure? The shield is not the treasure. The shield protects the treasure. Never confuse the two. The second principle, the hierarchy demands discipline. We learned tonight that the scholars, from Ayatullah Khoi to Imam Khamenei, agree on a fundamental point. Tawriyah is not lying. It is sadaq, truthfulness, because the speaker's intended meaning matches reality. This is not a minor technicality. It is a discipline of the tongue and the soul. The easy path is to lie. When the interrogator asks his question, when the hostile colleague probes your beliefs, when the situation demands an answer, the easy path is to simply fabricate. But the tradition teaches, find the truth that protects first. Craft the statement that is technically accurate while concealing what need not be revealed. Train your tongue to speak words that your heart can stand behind. This requires preparation. This requires presence of mind. This requires the cultivation of linguistic intelligence, the ability to think in layers, to speak in meanings, to find the narrow path between exposure and fabrication. The Prophet said we are from water because he had the presence of mind in the moment of danger to find a phrase that was true at every level. Hussein ibn Ruh said the Muslims have agreed by consensus because he had the political genius to describe a fact without confessing belief. This is a skill, and like all skills, it must be practiced and built. And the third principle, know your line. Imam al-Sadiq has said, Taqiyyah was only instituted to preserve blood, but if Taqiyyah itself reaches the point of causing blood to be shed, then there is no Taqiyyah. The reference is in the write-up. And Imam Khomeini had said, lacking power is an excuse, but if we acquire the power, Taqiyyah becomes forbidden. Again, the reference is in the write-up. Every believer must know where their line is. There are things you will conceal to survive, and there are things that you will die before concealing. There are situations where silence is wisdom, and there are situations where silence is betrayal. The line is not the same for everyone. The scholar has a different line to that of the layperson. The one with a platform has a different line to the one in obscurity. The one whose words would rally thousands has a different obligation to the one whose words would only reach his executioner. But everyone has a line, and if you do not know where yours is, you will discover it only when you have already crossed it, when you have already said the thing that should never have been said, or remained silent when speech was obligatory. So sit with this question. What will I never deny, even under threat? What truths are so central to my belief, my identity, my humanity, that concealing them would be worse than death? The one who knows his line can practice Taqiyyah with a clean conscience, because he knows that he is protecting, not betraying. He knows that his shield has edges, and that beyond those edges he will drop the shield and draw the sword. The one who does not know his line will drift, will find himself conceding more and more, rationalizing more and more, until one day he discovers that he has protected his body by surrendering his soul. So know your line, and when the moment comes, when the Yazid of your age demands what cannot be given, be prepared to stand with Hussein. Please give me a loud salawat and we move to the conclusion, the shield forged.
اللهم صل على
صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجه.
So we've covered much ground tonight, perhaps more technical ground than is usual. We trace the Quranic foundations, the exception clauses in Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, the validation of Ammar under torture, and the model of the believer in Pharaoh's household. We examine the linguistic roots, Taqiyyah and Taqwa, as two branches of the same tree, both meaning protection, both expressions of the wisdom that shields what is sacred. We distinguished kitman from kidhab, concealment from fabrication, the withholding of truth from the manufacturing of falsehood. We learnt the jurisprudential hierarchy, that the greatest living maraji have ruled Tawriyah to be an obligatory precaution, that this community is bound to seek truth first, even in danger. We understood the theological foundation, that God does not burden a soul beyond its capacity, that the religion has no dead ends, that the dispensation exists for genuine necessity rather than convenience, and we learnt the limits, that Taqiyyah ends where innocent blood begins, that the shield must be lowered when the sword becomes obligatory, that possessing power transforms silence into betrayal. This was necessary work. The accusations against our communities that we are liars, that our religion permits deception, that nothing we say can be trusted, has been levelled for 14 centuries. It has confused sincere seekers, embarrassed some of our own, and been weaponized by enemies who understand it all too well, and critics who do not understand it at all. Tonight we return to the sources, the Quran, the Sunnah, the teachings of Ahlulbayt, the examples of the companions, the rulings of the scholars, and forge the shield anew. The one who carries this knowledge can now respond to the accusation with the confidence of one who knows his tradition. Taqiyyah is not lying, it is shielding. Tawriyah is not fabrication, it is the discipline of finding truth that protects. And the community that practices these arts is not a community of liars. It is a community of survivors. Survivors who preserved the kernel through 14 centuries of persecution, who passed the light from hand to hand through the long night, who ensured that there would still be followers of the Ahlulbayt when the true dawn finally breaks. That is not cowardice, that is wisdom, that is the shield. But we're not finished. For tonight we are, but we're not finished with this series. Tonight we forge the shield. We understand its materials, the Quranic permissions, the linguistic roots, the jurisprudential principles, the theological foundations, at least on the surface. But a shield that sits in the armory protects no one. Next week, in the second part of the defensive movement, we take the shield into the field. We will examine Taqiyyah in action, how this principle has actually been applied across history and into our own time. We will study, firstly, the historical record. How did the community actually survive? What strategies did the scholars employ? How did the Hausa endure under the Abbasids, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Qajaras, and the Pahlavis? We will look at the Hassan-Hussein spectrum. We touched on this tonight, but we will develop it fully. When is patience obligatory? When does resistance become obligatory? How do we read the signs of our own time? And then you have Taqiyyah versus Nifaq, or Taqiyyah versus hypocrisy. The enemies claim that Taqiyyah is simply religious hypocrisy. We will dismantle that accusation at the root, showing the fundamental differences between the believer who conceals to protect and the hypocrite who conceals to betray. And then you have the nuclear fatwa. Perhaps the most striking contemporary example of anti-Taqiyyah was when Imam Khamenei declared nuclear weapons forbidden. Not merely unwise, but haram, forbidden. He demonstrated what happens when the community possesses power. The shield is lowered. The truth is declared openly. The world is told what we actually believe, regardless of strategic cost. And we look at the idea of makarim al-akhlaq, the noble character. We will explore how the community's posture towards the non-Muslim world has shifted from defensive concealment to active demonstration. In the age of Islamic revolution, the primary mode is no longer hiding the truth. It is showing the truth through conduct that refutes the lies. And we will address the question that haunts every conscious believer in the West. How do I live as a Shia in a society that does not persecute me, but does not know me? Is Taqiyyah even relevant in Manchester, in Toronto, in Sydney? Or has the dispensation ended and the obligation to speak begun? These are the questions for next week. Tonight the shield is forged. Next week we learn to carry it. Please give me a loud salawat. We have the supplication eulogy for wisdom. We ask God the Most High, the Protector, the Guardian, grant us the wisdom to know when silence serves the truth and when it betrays it. Grant us the discipline to find the words that protect without fabricating, to speak truth in layers when necessary, and to speak it plainly when possible. Grant us the courage to lower the shield when the moment demands, to stand with Hussein when the Yazid of our age crosses that line that cannot be crossed. Protect us from using your dispensation as an excuse for cowardice. Protect us from abandoning your dispensation out of recklessness. Make us among those who preserve the kernel without losing the shell, who guard the treasure without forgetting that the shield is not the treasure, and hasten the return of the one for whom the shield has been carried, the Imam of our time, the proof of God upon his creation, the one whose emergence will end the need for concealment forever, because on that day the truth will fill the earth as it has been filled with falsehood, and there will be no more hiding and no more fear, and the believers will finally be able to declare what they have carried in their hearts through the long, long night. O God, hasten his relief and make us amongst his helpers and supporters, and may the peace and blessings of God be upon Muhammad, the one who said, "We are from water," when the enemy sought his blood, the one who taught Ammar that the tongue under torture does not bind the heart, the one who calibrated his teachings to human capacity because he was sent as a mercy, not a burden, and upon the family of Muhammad, upon Ali, who concealed his right for 25 years to preserve the unity of the Ummah, upon Hassan, who made the treaty that preserved the kernel when war would have destroyed both shell and seed, upon Hussein, who lowered the shield and drew the sword when silence would have meant the death of Islam itself, upon Sajjad, who carried the teachings through the darkest hour in the language of supplication, upon Baqir and Sadiq, who built the school of Ahlulbayt in the brief window when building was possible, upon Al-Kadhim, who endured the prisons of the tyrants with patience and outlasted their power, upon Al-Rida, who navigated the court of Ma'mun without surrendering his soul, and upon Jawad, Hadi and Al-Askari, who preserved the line until the proof could be hidden, and upon the hidden Imam, the one who waits as we wait, the one who watches as we struggle, the one for whose sake the shield has been carried across 14 centuries, and who will one day emerge to end the need for shields forever. May our souls be sacrificed for him, may our efforts be accepted in his service, and may we be among those who greet him when he comes. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. Amen, O Lord Sustainer of the universes. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.